The world without devouring the planet, which we'll be talking about today. So there are many videos already online. If you Google George Monbiot, M-O-N-B-I-O-T, this includes his TED Talk from January 2023, which I've posted on Twitter at Betsy Kim, and it's also on George's Twitter feed at George Monbiot. And I don't want to retread too much of what's already out there, but to give us some context, George, can you give a quick summary of 3 or 4 of the main points of regenesis that you'd want most for our audience to know?
Thanks, Betsy. Yes, so we are facing a systemic crisis in food, and I don't think 1 in 1,000 people have really grasped what we're looking at here. It's not just a few issues like Russia's invasion of Ukraine or the COVID pandemic. It's actually a systemic crisis very similar to the crisis approaching 2008 with the financial system. And in fact, a lot of the dysfunctions in the food system mirror those of the financial system then. A few very large corporations with tremendous control, the standardization of the system everywhere, the same corporate strategies being pursued everywhere, regulations being ripped down, and this streamlining and efficiency of the system on behalf of big corporations actually makes it less resilient. It might be a good strategy for the individual corporation, but for the system as a whole, it loses its resilience, and then shocks can be more easily transmitted across it. Now, the global food system, just like the global financial system, is a complex system. It's got tipping points. And what that means is that if you pass a tipping point, a critical threshold, it can collapse from one equilibrium state into a different one, which means basically it just crashes, it falls apart. Now, when the global financial system was in that state and just about to collapse, and governments literally had a few hours to act, they were able to bail out that system with future money. But you can't bail out the food system with future food. So we're looking at potentially a really massive global crisis, a crisis on a scale we haven't seen before, which has been warned about in the scientific literature for 10 or 12 years. They've been saying this system's losing its resilience, it's looking worse every year, shocks are being more easily transmitted across it, there's more and more problems stacking up, and no government has taken those warnings seriously. In fact, they've scarcely featured at all in public life. So that's issue number 1. We've got this systemic frailty. We need urgently to do something about it, and I suggest some of the ways we can do that. Issue number 2 is that the food system is more than any other part of our human economy driving Earth systems themselves towards the brink. Now, we don't like to think about this because we all need to eat, we all need the food system, we all need farming, and we don't want to apply the same standards to food and its production as we apply to any other industry. But the harsh truth is that food production is the #1 cause of deforestation, of habitat destruction, of wildlife loss, of species extinction, of freshwater use, of soil degradation, and of land use. And it's one of the leading causes of climate breakdown, of water pollution, and of air pollution. So it's right up there at the top of the list. And unless we deal with these dysfunctions, even if we sort out every other damaging thing that we're doing to our beautiful planet, we will still push it over the brink. We will still destroy our life support systems solely through the way that we produce our food. And there's a particular aspect of food production, and this is even harder for some people to hear. And I'm sorry, but yeah, telling people what they don't want to hear, as you so rightly said, that is my job. The aspect of food production, which is by a very, very long way the most damaging and is sufficient by itself to drive some really catastrophic environmental shifts, is livestock farming, the farming of animals for meat, milk, eggs, and the rest. And this is, up there with fossil fuel production. There are two things above all others we need to do to protect and restore the living planet. One is to leave fossil fuels in the ground. The other is to stop farming animals. And while there's now some discussion about leaving fossil fuels in the ground, there's very little discussion about stopping farming animals. And so what I look at is the scale of these crises, and then the quite exciting ways in which we can grapple with them and, I believe, solve them and produce outcomes which are really better for everyone. Healthier food, cheaper food, which is much more attuned to our survival on this planet, plus a much more thriving living planet than we have at the moment.
One thing that I found very eye-opening about your book was what you mentioned, how environmentally destructive pasture, organic pasture-fed farming truly is. I mean, I would have imagined that transportation or manufacturing were the major culprits.
Yeah.
But your book points out the worldwide devastation with deforestation for farming, particularly is with the rainforest for beef from Brazil. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, sure. So we have got this so wrong. There's a big drive now by celebrity chefs and food writers and even some environmentalists to say you should be eating pasture-fed beef, grass-fed beef. That's the best thing to eat. This is the most destructive of all food products. It is driving destruction faster and further than anything else. Now, there's the issue of current destruction, not just in Brazil, Ecuador, in Madagascar, in Myanmar, in many parts of the world. Beef farming in particular, the ranching of beef, is the leading cause of deforestation, and in some other places sheep farming as well. So you've got the current destruction, but you've also got this embedded destruction in the farming that we're already doing, the ranching of beef and sheep, of cattle and sheep, which is already happening around the world, which has got a massive ecological opportunity cost and carbon opportunity cost, which in other words is what it prevents from happening. It prevents the restoration of habitats on a massive scale. It prevents the drawing down of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere on a massive scale. And what this comes down to, the crucial issue, is land use. And this issue should be at the top of the environmental agenda. It's one of the absolutely top environmental issues. And yet the only times we discuss it is when we're talking about urban land use. We talk about urban sprawl, and we're quite right to do so. Urban sprawl is a blight. It's bad for cities and it's bad for the countryside. But the entire urban area of the planet is just 1% of its land surface. All the homes, all the businesses, all the infrastructure, 1% of the land surface. Farming occupies 38%. But what farming are we talking about? Well, 12% of the land surface is under crops, of which almost half is crops being produced to feed to livestock rather than directly to humans. 26% of the planet, more than all other human land uses put together, and then some, is used for the ranching of primarily of cattle and sheep. This is a phenomenally profligate use of our most precious resource, which is land. And every hectare of that land that we use to produce that pasture-fed meat, which is so fetishized by food writers, is a hectare which isn't available for wild habitats, be they rainforests, be they natural grasslands, be they savannas, be they wetlands. These are the habitats on which the great majority of terrestrial life forms depend. And without those habitats, well, we're heading towards the sixth great extinction. Now, there was a very interesting study conducted in the United States, which said, what if we did what the food writers tell us to do and switch from corn-fed beef, which we all agree is bad enough in intensive feedlots, if we were to switch from that to pasture-fed beef, like they say? And they found that you would need 270% more land to produce cattle in the United States. And what that means is that you would have to cut down all the forests, drain all the wetlands, water all the deserts, degazette all the national parks, demolish all the cities, and you would still be importing a lot of your beef from Brazil. It's just not sustainable. And what we see here, and it's a classic example is people doing the pictures but not the numbers. They say, oh, that looks nice. I like the look of that. So that's what we want. And I eat it and I like it. So everyone should do it. But they don't see that it can't scale because the numbers are against it. Now, if we had several planets and no space for wild ecosystems on any of them, then we could all eat pasture-fed beef. But because we don't, we can't.
You do point to a solution to this problem, though, with precision fermentation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so I find lots of ways of making myself unpopular, not on purpose, but because I'm trying to think my way through this, following the evidence, going from first principles, seeing what we can best do about these existential crises. And of course, farming is just one of them, but it is a really, really huge part of it. And this leads me to, I suppose, the shocking conclusion that we have pushed multicellular organisms, plants and animals, to the absolute limit of what we can extract from them. In the case of some species like chickens, I think we've pushed them way beyond the limit. The way we treat them is just atrocious. The way we treat pigs is atrocious. If we treated our dogs and cats like that, we would literally be sent to prison. But it's just totally normal for us to treat these poor animals in this really, really shocking way. And we're doing that. We're treating them so badly because we're trying to squeeze a tiny bit more efficiency out of them, produce a little more with a little less, but we've really hit the limits there. But we've scarcely begun to explore the potential of single-celled organisms, microorganisms. And these are phenomenally productive. I mean, this isn't alien to our diets. We eat microorganisms with every meal. That our food is full of them. We deliberately introduce them to certain food like bread and cheese and yogurt and kimchi and sauerkraut, for example. But what if we were to look at microorganisms as a food source in their own right? Well, what you find immediately is that you can produce much, much more with much, much less. So, for instance, there was a study looking at methanol-consuming bacteria, and there's some amazing, incredible bacteria species which can do really staggering things. And some eat hydrogen, some eat methanol, and so you don't need any agricultural products to produce them, and you can absolutely shrink to a dot the resources required to grow them. And so this study said, how much land would we need to produce protein by this methanol eating bacteria route, rather than through the most efficient way of producing protein on Earth today, which is soy grown in the US? And they found they would need 1,700 times less land. And that means, wait for it, 132,000 times less land than for beef to produce the same amount of protein. And so my estimates, depending on the energy source, but with certain energy sources, if you were to use those, are that you could, if you wanted to, and I'm not suggesting we do, but you could produce all the world's protein on an area the size of Greater London, the city of London in the UK. All the world's protein could be produced that way. Now, what I'd like to see is a distributed and highly diverse set of ways of taking advantage of these incredible organisms. But it's amazingly efficient. You shrink the land footprint, you shrink the water footprint, you shrink the fertilizer footprint. And what that would then enable you to do is to release huge tracts of the planet for ecological restoration, for rewilding. And then you could stop the sixth great extinction in its tracks. You could bring back missing ecosystems, and you could draw down much of the carbon dioxide we've already released into the atmosphere.
Now, can you describe this precision fermentation a little bit more? Because I've seen pictures on your Twitter feed, for example, that the precision fermentation results in steak like food. It's not as if people are eating a bowl or a vat of bacteria.
Yeah.
It actually looks, and what you've reported, it has a texture and the taste also of steak. So can you describe more? I think some people might be familiar with Impossible Foods and the heme product that makes hamburgers look like food. Can you explain that a little bit more so people don't think they're eating one cellular organisms?
Sure. So we've been experimenting with fermentation for thousands of years, of course, and we've refined that and done all sorts of amazing things with it. You know, many of our most interesting foods and drinks come from fermentation, but this precision fermentation is about sort of refining it so that you are producing very specific products from particular organisms, instead of having this quite broad spectrum of organisms as you do in a lot of the traditional products we make. You have a more precise one, and you sort of deliberately create protein-rich foods with particular protein profiles, and then you can turn those into almost anything, and you can do so far more easily than you can with plant proteins. Now, the problem with plant proteins is that they're fairly low concentrations. They're very different from the profile of animal proteins, and they're all tangled up with secondary metabolites, which are compounds, chemicals, which taste pretty strong. And so it's hard to make realistic substitutes for animal products with them. But microbial proteins can be a lot closer to the profile of animal proteins. They can be at a much higher concentration, and they're not tangled up with those secondary metabolites. So there's much less processing required. You're much closer to your final product from the outset. So I went to visit one of these companies in 2019, the first of them I visited, called Solar Foods in Helsinki, which was producing a flour made from bacteria which eat hydrogen. It's a really compact and simple process. These hydrogen metabolizing bacteria using hydrogen much in the same way that plants use sunlight, but much more efficiently than photosynthesis. And what comes out at the end is a flour which is sort of bright gold in color, because these bacteria have beta carotene in, and is about 65% protein. Now, I asked the laboratory, could you make me a pancake out of this flour? Because I wanted to be the first person on earth to eat a pancake made of this bacterial flour. And they said, we will, but we want to test it first. So you're not going to be the first person, but you will be the first person outside the laboratory. So my vanity was slightly dented, but not completely. And so to make the pancake, we had to dilute this flour with wheat flour, because normally if you make a Western European style pancake, you know, you start with wheat flour, and wheat flour is only sort of 12 to 14% protein. So you have to add protein and fat to make a satisfying pancake. So you add eggs and you add milk. But in this case, when you're starting with 65% protein, if you just tried to make it out of that, you would make an omelette. I mean, it would be just, in fact, it already smelt like eggs. So it would be very similar to an omelette. So we had to take the protein content down by mixing it with wheat flour. And then you just need water. And they made me a pancake, which was uncannily like a pancake. I mean, it was the same. There's no way I could have picked it out in a blind tasting. And that's without any change at all to the product. That's just with the straight flour coming out the end of it. So it was a small flip for man. But anyway, but obviously it's not just pancakes. You can make a huge range of products this way, very cheaply, very easily. Initially substitutes for animal products, but then the sky's the limit, because this is an incredible flexible form of food production. And just as the first people to capture a wild cow weren't thinking about camembert, we have no idea what products might come out of this.
But there is a lot of fear of people tinkering in a genetic level or at the cellular level of what people deem as unnatural. So how do we get people to psychologically overcome this fear of science creating, quote, frankenfood? And how do you psychologically get people to accept steak created from a bacteria just as they accept cheese?
Sure. So, I mean, we've been tinkering at the genetic level with multicellular organisms now for about 12,000 years and produced some right horrors as a result. The absolute horrors of the way we farm and kill and process the animals that we produce. I mean, it's if we were to start from that, if it were the other way around, and we already were producing our food from microbes, and I would have come along and said, no, let's do something else instead. Let's domesticate this wild cow and the wild boar and the jungle fowl and this woolly ruminant in Mesopotamia, and we'll radically change their characteristics, and we'll castrate them and tusk them and horn them and do all these things without anesthetic, and we'll push them together in massive sheds and keep them in horrendous sensory deprivation, and then we'll take them to a different factory and we'll stun them and we'll cut their throats and we'll skin them and we'll chop them up. People will be absolutely horrified. And then if I introduce the issue of cheese, just imagine, they say, right, okay, so there are these secretions, right, which the female cow produces from her udders, these mammary secretions. It's like human milk, but it comes from a cow, from this wild animal. And if you mix those with a chemical produced from the fourth stomach of a nursing calf, they will turn into a wobbly mass of fat and protein. And then into that, you introduce particular live bacteria, and they digest that wobbly mass of fat and protein. And then you let it sit till it gets hard and yellow and stinky, which basically the excrements of those bacteria, and then you eat it. Can you imagine what people would say? They'd be absolutely horrified. So what I'm proposing is actually far less disgusting, far less outrageous than the way we produce our food today. And of course, getting people to see it that way, I mean, there are some hurdles to overcome, and I understand the reluctance, I understand the barriers, but we have to step back a little bit from this and say, look at how we're doing it right now. Do you think this is a great way to produce our food, killing 76 billion animals a year and rising all the time to feed ourselves with these massive environmental impacts, this really sort of unhealthy, incredibly unhealthy system at enormous planetary cost? No, this is a really, really stupid way to feed us once we've got an alternative. And now we have an alternative.
You're listening to George Monbiot on WNHH 103.5 FM in New Haven, Connecticut. So, George, about the public relations with making precision fermentation more widely adopted, do you think companies need to be giving out free samples, and that the government needs to perhaps support this kind of industry? Or what could be done realistically to speed up the adoption and technology of this product?
Well, first they need to be approved, and that does need a proper testing process. And no new food should ever be released onto the market unless we know it's safe. We know there aren't any unresolved issues. So that has to be done properly. But some countries are better at making that happen than others. Singapore is the world leader in getting a fast, effective, but safe regulatory process in place. US is doing pretty well. Europe and the UK are doing really badly. We're just not efficient about these things. It takes a very long time. It gets snarled up in bureaucracy. And so governments can support it by making sure that it's properly regulated. That there's no corners to be cut. There's absolutely, we must look at this as rigorously as with any other foodstuff. But at the same time, no unnecessary obstacles erected. So, it's got to be proportionate. We've got to do it properly. But having done that, then what we need, I think, is more research and development to get a wider range of products going quickly. It's at the moment, it's being left to private capital to do this. There's dangers in that, private capital often isn't very patient. Government funding can look to the longer term, but also, we don't want the same thing to happen to the new food economy as has happened to the old food economy. The old food economy is an absolute disaster zone when it comes to corporate control. We've got 4 corporations controlling 90% of the global grain trade. It's an absolute catastrophe. That's one of the things which makes the food system so fragile, right? But the answer there is not to ban the grain trade, because if you did that, billions of people would immediately starve. It's to break up those corporations. And we need the same thing in the new food economy. Intellectual property rights should be weak and antitrust laws should be strong. And that should be the same in every aspect of the economy. And the new food economy gives us an opportunity to break the stranglehold of existing corporations. But if governments get this wrong, it could enhance the stranglehold of existing corporations. So I think a role for people like you and me is to come in at this early stage and say, let's get this right. Let's not replicate all the stupidities of the existing system. Let's use this opportunity to diversify the system, diversify it in terms of our production, diversify it in terms of who's doing the producing.
Now, I've cut down on my meat consumption. I've bought meatless meat and plastic made out of cornstarch products, thinking these are biodegradable and at least I won't be contributing to that mega disgusting, huge plastic garbage island that's floating out there on the Pacific Ocean. But I learned from your book that actually these plant plastics are in many ways worse for the environment in using land to grow these materials to make these products. So what should I do as a daily consumer to help make a difference?
Sure. So the first thing is just to consume less of everything. We should just try to cut down. And, whether you think of yourself as a green consumer or an ordinary consumer, you almost certainly, I don't know anything about your consumption, but almost all of us in these rich nations are just consuming too much. And to the greatest extent possible, just consume less of everything. When it comes to food, there is a real difference you can make, which is to switch away from eating animal products, because these are so disproportionately damaging to the living world, and indeed to our own chances of survival. It's hard to see how we can get through the 21st century if we carry on eating as we are. But primarily, we should act as citizens rather than consumers. We've been told again and again, you are consumers. Think of yourself as a consumer. And as a consumer, we're generally pretty weak. There are some things we can do, and that shift in our diets is the biggest thing of all in any field that we can do to improve our environmental impact as consumers. But our power is pretty limited. We have to change the political systems as well. We have to change the economic systems as well. And for that to happen, we have to get together and create political movements. That's what our ancestors have done repeatedly. That's where all our freedoms come from. We wouldn't be able to vote. We wouldn't be able to talk freely to each other like this if it weren't for those political actions of our ancestors. And so we must build on that, and we must constantly demand a better world. And what I try to do in my work is to say, look, here are some ideas for this better world we could demand. But, just by putting the ideas out there, it doesn't change anything. But it's one part of the jigsaw. Any effective movement is an ecosystem. Lots of different people bringing their different skills in, working together, cooperating to create these better systems.
Connecticut is an interesting state because it's highly impacted by climate change, with rising sea levels and increasing storm activity and coastal flooding. And Superstorm Sandy showed the very real threat throughout New England that was posing dangers to industries, including hospitals. But Connecticut also has over 5,000 farms spread across over 380,000 acres, and agriculture contributes approximately $4 billion to the state's annual economy, employs 22,000 people in jobs. So how could a transition occur to shift to a healthier, more diverse agricultural industry, including with practices with some of the farmers you've featured, such as Tolly and Tim, who did things like rotating crops and planting perennials and allowing land to remain fallow.
Yeah.
How do you imagine these methods could replace or even influence current global farming practices, including here in Connecticut?
Well, the first thing to say is that the US, to a greater extent than any other nation, feeds the world. If it were not for the United States, the world would be a much hungrier place. When you look at the major agricultural commodities, it's up there. The US is up there as one of the principal producers of just about all of them. It's quite remarkable how important it is as a global producer. So it's really important, not just to the people of Connecticut, not just to the people of the United States, but to the people of the world, that the US gets this right and can continue to produce food well into the future. We all need that to happen right where you are. And there are some very exciting possibilities for just doing things better. But before I talk about one of them, can I just say that it's really important that we try to keep yields high. If crop yields fall, that means we have to use more land to produce the same amount of food. But at the same time, we should keep impacts as low as we possibly can. So how do we keep those yields high with less pesticide, less herbicide, less fertilizer, less damage to the soil, less irrigation water? These are the questions that we should all be asking, because we need the crops, but we need less damage associated with them. Now, one really exciting possibility, and in fact is more than a possibility, it's actually happening now, is something that scientists have been talking about for a century. It's been a dream of science for about a century, and it hasn't happened until now. And that is replacing the annual grain crops we grow with perennial crops. Now, almost all the grain we grow on Earth today comes from annual plants, which are plants which live and die within 1 year. And large areas covered by annual plants are pretty rare in nature. They generally only occur in the wake of a disaster. Volcanic eruption, a landslide, a major fire, which clears the land, which kills all the vegetation. And annual plants are great pioneers. They colonize bare land. They're really good at it. And they spread very fast. They reproduce quickly, occupy the land as fast as they can before the perennial plants, the long-lasting plants, come back in and crowd them out and take over the land again. So in order to grow our annual grain crops, and by grain, I mean all the cereal crops we grow, but also all the oil seeds and all the beans and peas and stuff, all the small seeded crops we grow, to produce them, we have to create a disaster every year. We have to kill everything, either by spraying it off or by ploughing the land. And then when the little seedlings are growing, we have to carry on killing everything. We kill the competing plants, we kill the bugs which might eat them, and then we have to apply lots of fertilizer and lots of water in order to protect these little delicate seedlings as they start to come through. And we pamper them, and then they reach maturity and we harvest it, and then we start the whole process all over again. So it's destruction, destruction, destruction every year. So what if we could replace those annual crops with perennial crops, which are plants you sow once, and then for several years from a single sowing, they will continue to give you a harvest every year? Well, the leading group on this worldwide is the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. And together with various academic groups around the world, it's been scanning thousands of candidate species which could become perennial crops, whether in their own right or by cross-breeding with existing annual crops. And so far, they've had one total success, which is now fully commercialized, which is a variety of rice, which they developed in collaboration with the University of Yunnan in China. And they have managed to produce this rice variety, which has stayed in the soil for several years now, producing the same harvest every year as the annual rice produces, but without having to start all over again every year. And farmers there are really keen to get the seed. I mean, there's tens of thousands of hectares now being used to grow this rice, and the farmers want to expand its production because for several reasons. One, it causes much less soil erosion. So you're not because you don't have to plow every year, you're not hammering and hammering and hammering that soil. Two, it needs much less in the way of inputs like fertilizer and crop chemicals, because once it's established, it's much stronger and more robust, and its roots go down much deeper. It needs less water, less fertilizer, and the rest, because it can draw up a lot more through its much deeper roots. But most importantly, perhaps there, because so many young people have left for the cities, it needs much less labor. You don't have to plant it every year. You just harvest it. And so for all those reasons, farmers are really keen to buy it. But the other thing about perennial crops is that they tend to be far more robust and resilient. So for instance, the Land Institute is developing a strain of perennial sunflowers, and it's grown them alongside blocks of annual sunflowers. And they had a major drought one year. It completely wiped out the annual sunflowers, but the perennial sunflowers sailed through it. And it's not surprising, because they got much deeper roots and much stronger structures above ground. And so they got more environmental resilience. So for all these reasons, you can greatly reduce the environmental damage, but you can increase their robustness at the same time. Once you've got the yields to the same level as the annual crops, and they have with the rice, and they're heading in the right direction with a whole load of other crops, then you've got a really big environmental solution right there.
Well, this conversation has made me feel very optimistic. I did call Atticus Bookstore on Chapel Street in New Haven, and they have 2 copies left of Regenesis if people want to go up and pick up their copy. But please indulge me in my very last questions that has 2 parts, if I may ask them. I saw on your Twitter feed a comment about atheism as you're defining our thoughts and experiences as within a contained physical system that ultimately and inevitably breaks down and ceases to exist. So is that part of your environmental advocacy? Are you stressing that there's no better place or worse place than here on Earth?
I would say there's no better place. There's certainly a lot of worse places. I wouldn't like to be on Venus or Mars, or in fact anywhere else at all. We're blessed with having an atmosphere, 1G of gravity, oxygen, all of these things, which an estate agent, a real estate agent, would tell you, oh, these are pretty good things to have. So I find my wonder and my joy and my inspiration from the natural world here on Earth. I mean, this precious planet is something so astonishing that no human mind could conceive it. It is beyond our ken. It's beyond our ability to imagine. And every year we find out more and more incredible things about it. Now, I believe myself this is all there is, because I'm fascinated by complex systems. And it's very hard to see how this interaction of complex systems called life can be sustained without all those things coming together. So, what is the self? It's this incredible mixture of mind and body and society and environment. It's all of these things coming together. If you cut off any one of those things, you lose that self. And whatever, if you think something survives us, it's not going to be the thing that we have and the thing that we are. And I know I'm again treading on very controversial territory here, but I just think we have the wonder around us. It's right here, right now. This is our revelation. This is our joy. This is our love surrounding us in this just mind-blowingly astonishing, wonderful, joyous planet that we inhabit.
Those are very wonderful thoughts to take away, but I'm just wondering, is there a possibility, and indulge me by going beyond, anything's possible, Betsy, but that life is beyond the physical reality of biochemistry, that what we don't know we can't explain in the finite system of our factual knowledge. So maybe there is a physical system of what I'm experiencing and it ends, but maybe there's something else that can still capture something about this physical system without my understanding exactly how. You know, like theoretically, if we move faster than the speed of light, we can go back in time, but by my experiences, that seems impossible. Maybe as the universe is infinite, our imaginations are infinite. Should possibilities of what might not make sense with our existing knowledge base be infinite too?
Yep, they could well be. I mean, you know, we know that we know a tiny, tiny fraction of what there is, and we also know that the world is too complex for the human brain to encompass. And there are mysteries. There are things we don't yet know. Now, it's my belief, coming from a scientific, empirical background, that, you know, give it enough time and enough study and enough tools, we will learn a little more every year, and we'll get a bit closer to unraveling some of these mysteries. We might even be able to reconcile some of the completely contradictory things we've been discovering about the world. But you could be right. You know, there could be more than science could ever describe. You know, I would hate to discount that possibility. As a matter of personal belief, I feel I have enough. It's here. It's now. This is where the wonder is. And the idea is to sustain the living planet as our center of faith, our center of, well, the thing that we want to keep going forever, or for as close to ever as we can get.
Well, thank you very much, George Monbiot, for speaking with us today on WNHH 103.5 FM, Law, Life, and Culture. I'm Betsy Kim.
Thanks so much, Betsy.